be about more like $8 or $9 million, but that's sort of the right range. Okay. Now, probably the most ambitious example of benefit cost analysis of all time was the Stern Review of the Economics of Climate Change. It's about 1,000 pages long, and it was commissioned by the British government along with others to evaluate the social benefits and costs of climate change. And it had many stages. And Edward is not here. So first, it tried to determine what were the largest sources of greenhouse gases. And Matt Green? Yeah. Do you remember what the Stern report said about what the most important sources of greenhouse gases were?
Let's see. Here's something about greenhouse gas emissions and fossil fuels.
Yep, fossil fuels are definitely one of the most important ones. Does anyone else know? There's one other really important one. Yeah, David?
I know that as forests get cut down, less carbon dioxide.
That's probably the third most important. Fossil fuels are the first. Does anyone know what the second is? Yeah.
Livestock?
Yeah, methane. Methane. I mean, most of it comes out of livestock. Some of it comes out of bogs as well. But yeah, a lot of it comes out of animals. Animals are actually a huge source of greenhouse gases. Second was to determine what the effects of these gases were on global climate. And Jace, how did they go about doing that?
Looking at the changes on the climate, they looked at the estimated damage by the greenhouse gases over the years in the past years.
Yeah, they basically looked at climate models, right? So like there's a whole profession of people out there who has the job of figuring out, you know, if the gases change by this much, how much will the global climate change? They basically constructed large-scale climate models which have lots of uncertainty in them, but which can give you some sense of the link between greenhouse gases and the climate, right? And the key point here was not to get one number, because the truth is these models are highly uncertain. It was more to get a sense of the range of potential outcomes that could result from certain things, because you want to take into account all the potential outcomes and how costly all of those are. So the third thing that they had to do was determine what the economic effects of these changes would be. And Victor Gutman, what were some of the most important economic effects that the report highlighted?
Well, you're gonna have like land won't produce as much, everything like because the climate's gonna be changing, you won't be able to do as much for land that you have been able to do with it.
Yeah.
Also, like hurricanes.
Yeah. So extreme weather is a big thing. Reduction in farm yields is another. There's one other thing that's really big. Do you remember? Flooding. Yeah. So like rising and those are all the main factors. Yeah. Rises in sea level. And finally, there's also just the direct harms of like it being too warm, and some people like that, some people not like that. So for some people, that's positive, right? I think Chicago probably wouldn't be too depressed about a little bit of global warming, but. And finally, they had to determine the extent to which adaptation to the climate change would mitigate some of these harms. And Sung Ho?
Yeah.
How might you go about thinking about that, or how did they think about that?
Well, they had measures, but like as you said in the slide, like they lacked some kind of intuitions. Like for example, like the Dust Bowl of the 30s.
Yep.
They had like erosions and effects on the ecological systems, but they should have put more sort of economical approach to it, like intuition-wise.
Yeah.
So what did it actually have on, not only on ecological systems, but on like second and third parties? That externalities.
Yeah. So like for example, one thing you could do is look back in time at like other disasters that occurred and figure out how quickly people adapted to those situations. So like, the Dust Bowl would not cause that much harm if people were able to like, change, take care of the soil better, move out of that area, whatever. And so you can look at how much harm was actually created by that, not just how much it would seem like was created by it if people didn't figure out some way to accommodate to the disaster that occurred, right? So you shouldn't just take things as given, you should look at how people actually adapted. One big problem, though, that the world is facing is that the incentives aren't really there for good adaptation. So, Hurricane Katrina caused so much damage because no one had to pay for flood insurance in Louisiana because they knew the government would come and bail them out afterwards, rather than actually having to pay for the flood insurance. And that gives people very little incentive to move away from areas that are likely to get flooded as the waters rise through climate change, right? And so that's a big problem that I think might get in the way of some of this stuff. Yeah, Max?
Well, I think the Dust Bowl, wouldn't that be a too specific or too time specific example? I mean,
Yeah.
it was relatively sudden, while climate change,
Yeah.
the effects would be felt more over, decades and even a century.
No question.
So maybe that would, people would have more time to adapt if it's, for a longer period of time.
No question. I mean, these things are really hard, right? I mean, there's not really good counterfactuals or good historical examples of anything. You have to find something to compare things to, So, and you also have to do sort of a similar analysis for other impacts of climate change other impacts of greenhouse gases beyond just changing the climate. And Clementina, do you remember what they were talking about some other effects of greenhouse gases?
What in related to the water?
Yeah.
Potentially hurricanes just because of the different changes, for instance, if the water is too near the air shifting, there can be other particles that can be over salty or less salty.
Yeah, exactly. The ocean, the flow of salt through the oceans, and also the carbon itself makes it harder for the air to absorb some of the salt out of the oceans. Ecosystems can be damaged by the changes in the atmospheric gases or the temperatures. Lots of species might go extinct, et cetera, et cetera. Corresponding to the debate between, cap and trade versus putting on a pollution tax, there were basically two approaches taken in the report to figuring out what the right type of intervention was. And Jeff, do you remember what those two approaches were?
I think I might have read the wrong summary. All I remember seeing was just the recommended course of action and the figures that affected it. I
Oh.
don't remember speaking specifics about it.
Well, so they basically thought about two. Tell me if this was in it or not, but they talked about two ways. One way was to try to figure out what the marginal harm of a little bit more greenhouse gas was, sort of given this situation that we're in or are likely to be in. And the nice thing about taking this approach is it only required estimates of the actual effects of climate change through the weather and so forth. You don't need to know anything about the technology that we have to adapt or what's likely to be invented that will help us, reduce the amount of climate change and so forth, right? So this is simpler and less assumptions are needed to do this analysis, but the problem is that the effects of climate change are almost certainly very, very nonlinear. So when you get past some point, everything might really go to hell. And if that's the case, then it's really not sufficient just to say, here's what the marginal harm is right now. You have to figure out what's likely to be the amount that's polluted, and then, try to figure out, we don't really want to go much beyond some point, how do we avoid doing that? And, the reason why things can be so bad is that a few degrees warming might just, warm things up, make Chicago a bit more pleasant, and so forth. But, 7 or 8 degrees warming could, potentially just extinct humanity or something like that. So, and most of the harm associated with climate change actually doesn't come from the small effects. It comes from the small probability of potentially catastrophic effects. So their estimate was that the marginal externality is approximately $85 per ton of carbon emitted. The other approach they took was to think about the socially optimal level of carbon. And the good thing about that is that dealt with this nonlinearity. It let us actually figure out what would be the right amount that we don't want to go beyond. but it requires really understanding what are the opportunities for mitigation. Because if there are, easy things we could invent that would allow us to greatly reduce carbon, this is going to suggest a very low level. If there aren't other things that are easy to invent, this might suggest a quite high level, and we are like highly uncertain about that, much more uncertain even than we are about the climate effects. So their estimate was that it would be optimal to stabilize the atmospheric carbon at 450 to 550 parts per million, which would basically lead most likely to somewhere between a 3 to 5 centigrade rise in temperatures, but could potentially lead to a lot more or a lot less. So I think the thing that's useful about reading the Stern report is less that it's a template for how you should conduct these things, but rather it shows you how difficult it is to do one of these analyses, because there's so many things that are uncertain. And this is even with the best minds in the world working on it. The IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, on which the scientific parts of this were based, comprised something like 50 Nobel Prize winning scientists and like almost 2,000 other scientists. And yet all they have is these highly, highly uncertain numbers. And it's not even clear what those uncertainties depend on, which different people might disagree on. So it's very, very ambiguous. But this is the sort of thing you need to do if you want to really figure out what externalities are. So that's just the job of determining externalities. And there's a bunch of things that could radically change this analysis. So for example, there's something called geoengineering, which involves alternatives to just reducing carbon that might stop the worst outcomes of climate change. So you can put these sulfites into the atmosphere that reflect the sun and basically cool things down artificially. And that might eliminate the worst possible outcomes, right? Because if it starts to really get hot and that's really a problem, you could always use this stuff. That might be unpleasant, that stuff might cause acid. There's all sorts of problems with that. But it could at least avoid some of the worst outcomes. But once you're avoiding the worst outcomes, if those were the source of most of the harms, then maybe climate change isn't so bad. So depending on how bad those things are or how much they allow you to avert the worst of the outcomes, that could really radically change a lot of the analysis. So it just depends on a lot of things. And so it's a very difficult exercise. Okay, so the Stern Review basically focused on very sort of hard economic costs, like the sea levels rise, they wipe out a city, or the rains stop and you can't grow crops. So those are things that are relatively easy to measure, sort of from an relatively objective perspective. But there's a lot of other stuff that's really hard to measure. So for example, do people like it being warmer, or cooler, or rainier, or whatever, right? And while that might sound a bit silly and maybe not a major source of harm, the truth is that real estate in the San Francisco Bay Area for the same thing is about 4 times as expensive as it is in Chicago. And along other dimensions, I guess some people might argue San Francisco is a nicer city than Chicago, but I don't think very much. So, it's got to be that the reason that land is so much more expensive in California is people really like the weather there, right? And that's like a huge amount of money. So if you were to turn Chicago into having the same weather as California, that might have, economic benefits on the order of a % or 2 of GDP, right? Similarly, but how do we measure that, right? You can use these real estate things, but it's tough. How much do people care about the animals that might die? How are we supposed to value that, right? Global warming has the potential to cause giant mass extinctions, and we have to figure out some way to value all that stuff. We also have to think, what value does it have to the world if New York City gets wiped out? Obviously part of that is just the purely economic losses, but I think everyone would say that, Washington, D.C. or New York City getting wiped out has some real value beyond the economic losses, which is that it has sort of a moral or, spiritual meaning for most Americans, right? We put a lot of value on preserving cultural artifacts, so how do you value those? Another thing is that